Yoav Gallant has been fired by Benjamin Netanyahu. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has fired his defense minister Yoav Gallant, a figure widely considered by Israel's international allies to be a brake on the far-right elements of the country's coalition government, prompting protests around Israel. Netanyahu said in a video statement late on Tuesday that significant gaps on handling the battle in Gaza had emerged. At the height of a war, complete trust is needed between the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister. In recent months, that trust between me and the Defence Minister was damaged, he said. The move prompted protests across the country. We actually have some of that footage of the protest now.
It's a spontaneous outburst of rage because we had this webinar. It is firing of the only minister that still had some thoughts about the hospital is completely
I saw you shaking your head.
Because the government is again failing us. In the middle of a war, they are really firing a minister that is the only minister that we thought he cares. He cares for the people that are abducted in Gaza, and he cares for the soldiers, and he really cares for the country.
Likud Party member and current Foreign Minister Israel Katz is to be the replacement. Kevin, I'd like to get your initial thoughts on this move from Netanyahu.
Clearly, Gallant was going to be something of a check on some of the excesses of the Netanyahu government. He was one of the very few senior politicians in the coalition who spoke out against his judicial reforms, which were, when I say judicial reforms, he wanted to nerf the Israeli judiciary so that he would be essentially immune from prosecution for his many and varied corruption crimes. So the fact that he had some semblance of principle there meant he was always going to kind of clash to a degree with Netanyahu. But I do have to somewhat push back on the wording of the article, and indeed much of the press on this. When they say he was a curb on the excesses of the far right on this, he is the far right on this as well. Like, he's not like this. He's some like misunderstood liberal in the sea of fascists. No, he's just the tiniest shade less fascist than the other fascists who are the fascist government of Israel. He is a genocidal Zionist freak. That's what he is. So no one needs to feel sorry for him personally, but this is clearly an attempt by Netanyahu to stamp out any semblance of independence from the war cabinet, and to further the Zionist claims over northern Gaza, and indeed to further their expansionist intent in southern Lebanon as well.
I mean, I agree with the wording. In fact, in my script, I write about that. I mean, in that paragraph, it states that the international allies think that Gallant was a break on the far right. I mean, yes, he is the far right, and he's hardly done much to restrict Netanyahu. I mean, he's used legal procedures, okay, but he hasn't stopped the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who've been killed. So I think we can safely assume that Netanyahu thinks he's being restrained. And this new appointment means it's only going to get much worse, especially now with Trump being in the White House from January.
Yeah, I mean, this is undoubtedly timed with a certain amount with that in mind, because he knows he's going to get absolute carte blanche. We know this. Sheldon Adelson's widow, literally in the lead up to the election, it was discussed with Trump that her financial support was absolutely predicated on Trump acceding to the full annexation of the Gaza Strip. So that's what we have to look forward to. That's what is undoubtedly going to become US policy and indeed Israeli state policy. Because again, it was never about hostages. It was never about defeating terrorism. It was about land grabbing. It was about expansion. But yeah, in what way can Gallant say that he did actually hold back the Netanyahu government? I mean, what would he have done without that being held back? Was he going to invade the moon? Like, what was left for him to do exactly?
Precisely.
Like, if this is him being restrained, God only knows what he's going to be like off the leash, I suppose.
Well, which is probably what we're going to see now, because it is obviously Yoav Gallant gone, but again, I refer to Trump again. Trump is far worse than this issue, and he's now going to be the most powerful man in the world, backing Israel. I do want to get your thoughts on the video we had of the protest. Now, of course, they're not pro-Palestine protests. I mean, there was singing Yoav Gallant's praises. But what does it say that even people who are, on board with the project essentially are now angry at Netanyahu for this? I mean,
It's not.
what do you think's there? What do you think's going through people's
It's not
minds?
massively surprising. We saw earlier on during the war when Netanyahu basically abandoned all chances of actually getting hostages back. They were
Yeah.
literally offered a deal: stop the war, and we'll hand the hostages back. And he said, "Nah, fuck that noise," and carried on doing his thing. And there were massive protests in the street. Most of whom are Zionists. Most of Israeli society is unfortunately Zionist. It is the very much the rot at the core, the cancerous tumor which eats away at the soul of that nation. Um, yeah, most of those people are Zionists, but they actually don't like Benjamin Netanyahu, who's a phenomenally unpopular man, and literally one of the key underwritten parts of this entire affair is that this has gone on as long as it has because Benjamin Netanyahu is looking after himself and his wife to an extent. Because as soon as this war ends, he stops being prime minister and he goes to jail for his crimes. So he's just keeping this going. He's just keeping this going longer and longer and longer so that he can find some way to get diplomatic immunity. That's all that's taking place there. He's killing hundreds of thousands of people just to avoid justice for his crime.
I mean, it's clear that his facade isn't working as you've described,
Mm.
as we've seen in the footage there. And yeah, Netanyahu is unpopular, so people aren't buying into the idea that everything he's doing is in I don't know, the interest of national security. But then that to me then says, well, if you know he's doing this to prolong the war, why aren't you, I don't know, protesting earlier? I mean, I suppose they have.
They have, but
Um,
unfortunately, the Israeli state has a way of turning the fascism inward because that's what always happens, of course.
well, true. Yes,
We've seen
yes.
with the very noble Orthodox community in Israel, who not all of them, of course, but a great many, who have campaigned vociferously within Israel against the occupation and against the IDF and the Israeli government's actions, and they've been brutally suppressed by the authorities. Because again, this is not
Hmm.
about defending Jewish people; it's about defending Zionism. Zionism is the cancer upon Judaism. It's as simple as that. It's a cancer upon the Jewish communities around the world and in Israel. If you oppose in any respect the ultra Zionist push, they will use any and all methods, up to and including Mossad subversion, in order to destroy you. Because again, they don't mind hurting Jewish people if it helps Zionism.
I was going to ask you kind of a hypothetical then. Had Kamala Harris won?
Yeah.
Okay, I know that Joe Biden said he's himself said he is a Zionist.
Yes.
I don't know whether Kamala has actually said I am a Zionist. I mean, she's obviously been complicit. But an alternative timeline, Kamala Harris is president, and you're getting more and more people unhappy with Benjamin Netanyahu, more and more protests. Could there have been a slight inflection point there where the US could have potentially used that and exploited that sort of hole within the Israeli government to try and curb them a little bit? I mean, I don't believe that the US State Department wants Israel to do what they're doing. I think they're complicit.
Yeah.
I don't think they care enough, but I don't think they want to, as in Trump wants that to happen. So could have that been
I
a real change there? Or
I think so. The problem with actually drawing that comparison when eventually Trump gets in and starts doing this stuff is that we can only compare it to a hypothetical of what Kamala Harris might have done. So it's less concrete than we would, I suppose, ideally like. But I think there's no doubt that whilst I don't think she's ever really called herself a Zionist, that's a distinction without a difference. She has actively supported the Zionist cause. She's been the vice president for Genocide Joe. So I don't really care whether she calls herself that or not. She fundamentally is one. Um, but I think, like you say, the US State Department don't want this because it's embarrassing. It's in fact incredibly difficult on a diplomatic level for them to have to negotiate this. So what I think would have happened was you would have seen behind the scenes moves from the United States to try and install. I mean, it's going to be another Zionist and another piece of shit, but a piece of shit who doesn't have a personal vested interest in keeping the war going in order to not be in jail, and have them replace Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister and then come to some sort of arrangement. Because this, at the very least, is a thorn in the side for America because it makes the idea of international rules-based order so ridiculous. There's no way we can sit here and say to finger wag of Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or anyone else about international law, whilst at the same time going, no, Israel has carte blanche to just like slaughter children and stuff. That's fine. You know, it's ridiculous.
Support independent media. Support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.